Hi, I'm talking to Andy Imparato, Executive Director for the Association of University Centers on Disabilities. Hi, Andy.
Hi, Tom. It's great to be here.
Starting off, my first question to you, Andy. Coming from the Hill and from the nonprofit profit sector, what has been the most rewarding and what has been the most challenging for you in working with our university centers?
Well, great. That's an interesting question. As you know, September 30th this year was my fourth anniversary in the job, so I feel I've been joking that I finished my first term, but I didn't have to run for reelection, so that's good. There's been so many positive things. It's hard to single out one thing, but I would say one of the things that I really appreciate about our network is the diversity of expertise. It's about a $650 million network with about 6,000 FTEs. So, if you're looking for somebody who knows a lot about early childhood or, brain development or kind of the science of brain development or aging with Down syndrome or how to get better health outcomes in rural America for people with disabilities. I mean, there's just so many topics. Technology accessibility, website accessibility. Kind of discrete cultural issues like vocational rehabilitation for the American Indian community. Working on emergency response and recovery in places like Puerto Rico right now. There's just a lot of expertise in our network, and for me, as somebody who's been working in the field for a long time, it's fun to have a network where there's always new people for me to meet, new expertise to tap into. And I feel like a big part of my job in the first 4 years it's almost been like a discovery job. I've been out there in the field finding people who have expertise and then thinking about, okay, how do I connect them with other people who could really benefit from their expertise or who would want to collaborate with them around that expertise. I would say the biggest challenge is I didn't come out of higher education, so I really have had to learn kind of some of the unique issues when you do this work in a university setting. My nature is to go out there and build relationships with funders, but if you work in a university, that's not always straightforward because the university is building its own relationships with funders. Same thing with talking to elected officials. My nature is for my directors to go out there and build relationships with elected officials, but in a university setting, you often have to do that in coordination with an office that's designed to manage relationships with government. So it's just a matter. I mean, I don't think that was a big challenge, but it's just something for me to get used to and pay attention to as I'm trying to cultivate political relationships and funding relationships on behalf of the network.
With the results of the past election, what do you see as some of us would say that that has created some challenges? How do you see us moving forward
You
with the
know,
current administration?
yeah, I mean, I think there were a lot of challenges facing the disability community before the election, and I think we had a lot of challenges when President Obama got elected. We had a lot of challenges when President Trump got elected, and we will probably have a lot of challenges when President Trump's successor gets elected. So, to some degree, I feel like part of our responsibility is to keep our eye on what are the outcomes that we care about and not get distracted too much by all the noise around politics. So, um, when President Obama took office, people with disabilities were disproportionately outside the labor force. When he left office, people with disabilities were disproportionately outside the labor force. So you might say President Obama was a great president for people with disabilities, and in some ways he was, but we didn't move the needle in a significant way on that very important outcome. You could look at education outcomes, you could look in other areas. So I feel like we're going to be at our best as a network and as a community if we stay focused on outcomes. We are kind of neutral in terms of the ideologies that we collaborate with to try to get better outcomes. but we do try to build relationships across the political spectrum and, basically use our education role and our education mission to make sure that policymakers know the data. Most people in Congress, and I would guess most people in the Arizona state legislature, do not know the labor force participation rates for people with disabilities, and they don't know how those rates have moved or not moved over the last 30 years. So we still have a lot of basic education to do. And then I think once they understand there's a problem, they're going to have different approaches to solving the problem. But I think our biggest task initially is to make sure people are both have a deep understanding of some of the significant challenges facing our community and have some motivation that there are ways to address those challenges and that we're not kind of a lost cause, that no matter what you do, we're not going to get better outcomes.
Thank you. I think you raised some really good points. What are some concrete examples you have seen programs in our network do to show themselves as resources to their communities and states?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, I feel like one of the most important things that we can do as a network and at the individual center level, as you know, we have 67 University Centers for Excellence in Developmental Disabilities and 52 leadership education and neurodevelopmental and related disabilities programs. And then we have 14 NIH-funded intellectual and developmental disability research centers. So I would say across that span of centers and programs, we really have underinvested in communications. We don't typically, and part of this I think is higher education. I think sometimes in higher education, people get rewarded for publishing things in peer-reviewed literature, but they don't always get the same level of prestige if they break it down and put it out there in a podcast or in some other format. So, I mean, I'm very intrigued by what you all do here in terms of podcasts and just the amount that you've invested in communications. I feel like the rest of the network can learn from you. I mean, just looking at your posters and what you do to promote what you're doing, I really feel like it's a handful of centers that are investing in that, and I would love to see more centers do that. So, the Institute on Disabilities up at the University of New Hampshire, they have Matt Giannino, who's a part of the senior staff, who has a full-time communications role and is very good at it. Vanderbilt University has a senior staff person who is in charge of communications and is very good at it. So as you travel around the network, some stand out. But, I remember when I visited the University of Minnesota, which actually produces a lot of beautiful video content and has done a lot. But I remember asking the leader of the USED, David Johnson, I think their USED when I visited him was like a $26 million USED, so it was one of our bigger USEDs. And I said, is there anybody on your staff whose job it is to do communications? Nothing else, just communications. And he said no. So if you have a $26 million budget and yet you're not hiring anybody to have a focused effort on communications, I feel like that's more the norm than the exception in our network. And I'd like to get to the point where that becomes the exception and the norm is that people are investing in communications. So your question was broader than communications. You were talking about partnerships in the community, but I feel like it starts with good communications. If the community doesn't know what you do, it's hard for them to know how to partner with you or access what you do.
And how to see us as a resource.
Absolutely. I mean, I think one of our biggest challenges as a network is it's a $650 million network with a huge universe that could benefit from our expertise, a global universe that could benefit from our expertise. But the vast majority of the people who could benefit from our expertise don't know that we exist and therefore don't know how to access our expertise.
Thank you. Follow-up question. Likewise, what have you seen programs do to show themselves as a resource to policymakers?
Yeah, I mean, I think we're doing better in that area, in part because I have yet to visit a center that doesn't care about policy. I mean, I think it's just part of our DNA as a network that policy is an important part of what we do as Centers for Excellence. I mean, we exist to innovate, and one of the ways that we innovate is we develop better approaches to education, employment, public health, you name it. We develop better approaches, and then we try to work with policymakers to help scale up evidence-based approaches. So, I just visited the center at Utah State University this summer. They've had a great relationship with Senator Hatch going back pretty much as far back as Senator Hatch goes back, which is a long time. So he's got a disability advisory group that he meets with regularly, and it's been chaired by a leader at the Utah USAID going back to Marv Fifield when he was the director there. So that's a really nice partnership because it's a long-term relationship. They know that Senator Hatch is not going to vote the way that they might want him to vote on every issue, but there's lots of respect and lots of love between Senator Hatch and the center at Utah State University, and there's always an open door where they can share information, try to help answer questions that Senator Hatch or his staff might have. And, again, just build a good long-term relationship where they're almost part of a back office to his Senate staff, and when they need stuff, they know that there's a great world-class center at Utah State University that they can go to for advice. There are a number of folks in our network, as you know, Tom, who've done Kennedy Fellowships where they come to Washington for a year, work for an elected official, and then go back to their center. So people that have done Kennedy Fellowships typically stay in touch with the offices where they worked, and that's led to some very nice long-term relationships where they've been able to be a resource for that office after the fellowship was over. But again, I would say most of our centers have a good relationship with their state legislators and their federal delegations. Part of that also has to do with continuity. Sometimes it takes time to build a relationship. The average tenure of a USAID director is 14 years. That gives you time to build those relationships. It doesn't have to happen overnight. And then again, if you're building, like at Utah State, you're building the relationship on behalf of a center that's going to be around for a long time. You guys are celebrating your 50th anniversary this year. So the centers have the opportunity to build those long-term relationships with elected officials as well, and I think a lot of them are doing it.
Being in a network for a long period of time, I've had the experience of working with some of our champions in the network who have done excellent work in working with their congressional delegation. The person that comes to my mind is Bob Bacon.
Absolutely. Who was a Kennedy Fellow.
Who was a Kennedy Fellow.
Yeah.
Can you share with us how Bob was so successful in nurturing that relationship?
Yeah, so first I think Bob genuinely loves policy. He gets excited about policy, he gets excited about ideas. He's operating in a state, Iowa, which is where my boss, Senator Harkin, was from, that is very bipolar, if you will, in terms of the politics. They vote for Republicans and Democrats for Senate, for president, for governor. So in that universe, Bob, I think, learned early on, and interestingly, he did his Kennedy Fellowship in a Republican office in the House. He learned early on how to be relevant and helpful across an ideological spectrum. So in Iowa, he's built relationships with the state Medicaid agency that have lasted through Democrat and Republican governors. At the federal level, he's built long-term relationships with Senator Grassley, Senator Harkin, other members of the Iowa congressional delegation. But I do think it starts by loving policy and knowing your audience and being able to talk about policy in compelling ways, regardless of whether you're talking to a Republican or a Democrat. And then over time, as you do that, you build a cadre of people who know you and respect you, and they go to bat for you when other people are trying to find out, well, who is this Bob Bacon guy? There are lots of Republicans who will say, oh, he's a good guy. He might be a Democrat, but he's been very easy to work with, and he's helped us a lot on a number of issues.
Thank you. As the director of an association of primarily university-based programs, what do you see as our primary strengths?
Well, I think, I like to, actually, it's funny, we were just talking about Bob Bacon. I like the way Bob Bacon described our mission one time when we were doing strategic planning when I first started at AUCD. He said, "We exist to solve problems in the disability space." And I kind of like that way of thinking about who we are. I mean, we do so many different things, you can't always sum it up in one sentence, but it's an interesting way to think about why we exist. I mean, Eunice Kennedy Shriver and her brother, President Kennedy, they created this network because children with intellectual disabilities were not getting the outcomes that Eunice and her brother thought were possible. So the idea was, we have a problem. Let's go to the best and the brightest. Let's go to universities across the country, have them study this problem, and help us develop better solutions where young people can have, a better life in the community with an intellectual disability. And then over time, we've branched out from children to lifespan. We've branched out from intellectual to developmental to many of our centers, as you know, are doing work across the spectrum of disabilities. So I like the idea that we solve problems. Now, how do we solve problems? Well, we develop new approaches. We evaluate the new approaches. We develop evidence. We try to scale things that work. We train people so they know about the evidence and they know how to apply it in their work. We try to have model clinical programs and other things going on in the community, and we evaluate them. We like to do stuff in an interdisciplinary way that brings multiple perspectives, multiple types of expertise to bear. And we cultivate leaders. We cultivate leaders across multiple disciplines and family leaders and people with disabilities as leaders. So I think that's the approach we take, but fundamentally we exist to solve problems.
And we collaborate.
Absolutely, absolutely. And, I think the interdisciplinary bias that we have is a bias towards collaboration more broadly. If you're working with, today I had an event that you organized with the head of the ARC in Arizona. If our centers are working with the ARC and they're working with the state legislature and they're working with the business community and they're working with the self-advocacy community and they're working, across different departments in their university, they're probably going to understand the problems and have a more multifaceted response to the problems than if they're just doing it in a vacuum.
Right. Likewise, where do you see us improving as university centers? You kind of pointed out the area of communication, but are there other areas that you see us improving in?
Yes, well, Tom, you've been a leader in our network for a long time on one of the areas. I mean, I feel like in order for us to be credible as a leader in the disability space in the 21st century, we need more people with disabilities in leadership, and we need more people from diverse racial and ethnic backgrounds in leadership. Part of that is just the nature of doing this work in the United States and trying to serve all the populations that exist in this country. But part of it is also recognizing that with the implementation of the UN Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities, the rest of the world is paying attention to disability, things like inclusive education, employment, other areas. They're paying attention in a way that they probably haven't on this scale in human history. So that creates an opportunity for our network. Are we ready to deliver our expertise globally? And if we're going to do that, we have to do it in a way that's culturally and linguistically competent. And if our network doesn't have those skills, we're not going to be as effective when we try to deliver that expertise across the world.
Thank you. As a program that had its beginning in the 60s, that started with the vision of President Kennedy and his sister, how do you see us evolving in the next decade?
Yeah, it's interesting to think how old we are. I'm 65. I was born in 1965, so I feel like I'm almost as old as the network. I think the first centers were created around when I was born. So I feel old. So to some degree, I think we have some years on us as a network, and I do think it's important to always try to be nimble and responsive to changes in society. I mean, we were created before the internet. Have we fully embraced the importance of the internet for the work that we do now? We were created when cultural and linguistic competence wasn't kind of as front and center as it is today, but have we adjusted with the changing demographics of our country and the shrinking of the world, in part because of the internet. It's a lot easier for people to access our expertise online than it was when we were created. There was no online, or certainly not beyond some narrow areas of academia. Um, and I think to some degree we've got every few, I guess about every 10 years we have a new generation. So we've got the millennials. Are we relevant and delivering what the millennials see as what they need to be able to be leaders in the disability field? Whatever's coming after the millennials, are we ready for that? So I feel like, in part because our culture is an entrepreneurial culture, and we're always on the lookout for the next thing. We have kind of an innovative culture. I feel like we're better positioned than a lot of national disability networks to be relevant for whatever comes next. But we do have to be explicit about recognizing that change is a good thing and that we have to always be ready to embrace change if we want to stay relevant.
Do you feel that we're preparing the next leaders in the disability arena?
I mean, that's a personal priority for me. I feel like one of the niche areas that our network is well positioned to fill is to be the place where leaders in the disability field come to get better as leaders. So it could be service providers, it could be family leaders, it could be people with disabilities as leaders, it could be political leaders. I met yesterday with Maggie Hassan, the freshman senator from New Hampshire, who has a 29-year-old son, Ben, with an intellectual disability. And, she said to me, Andy, I want you to know that I went through a leadership training that your center in New Hampshire put on, and my son Ben is going through a leadership training right now at your center in New Hampshire. That was music to my ears. I mean, I think to the extent that there are people who have been a Lend Fellow or done Partners in Policymaking or participated in any of the ways that we try to cultivate leaders, for them to go on and lead at the level that she's leading at as a United States Senator on the Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions Committee, I mean, that's a beautiful thing. And I think we could be doing more of that. And I think as we do it, we need to explicitly be trying to do it for Republicans and Democrats, conservatives, liberals, moderates, Bernie Sanders supporters, everything in between. Because we do need leadership in all of those parties. It doesn't work for us to put all our eggs in one basket.
Again, I'll end with this last question. I think the last time we did one of these things, I asked you the same question. What question or questions did you wish I had asked that I did not ask you?
I guess it might be interesting to think a little bit more about what it's been like for me as a person with bipolar disorder who's open about it, a proud person with a disability who sees myself as a part of the disability movement, to navigate an academic network like ours where a lot of the leaders don't have disabilities, and some of the leaders don't necessarily see themselves as part of the disability movement. I mean, I would hope that most of our leaders do see themselves that way, but I think certainly some of the scientists in our network see themselves as scientists, and whether they're actually connected to a disability movement may not be a front and center thing for them. And I guess I would say it's been surprisingly easy. I don't know if you remember. I think you were there at the conference when I was kind of introduced. This was 4 years ago, and I cried. I didn't expect to cry, but I cried when I was, introducing myself. And I remember saying, that I appreciated that the selection committee was comfortable hiring a person with bipolar disorder to be their executive director. And I guess the reason I cried is notwithstanding whatever I've been able to achieve in my career, I always thought that there would be jobs that I just couldn't get because of the diagnosis, that there was enough of a stigma associated with the diagnosis that when push comes to shove, they're not going to want to give that job to a person with bipolar disorder because it's too risky. Like, what happens if they have a psychotic episode when they're supposed to be doing something, that we need them to do? Or how are they going to manage staff? Like, whatever the issues are, usually if you think hard enough, you're going to come up with concerns about somebody with mental illness for a very important job. So I don't know. There was a part of me that's like, I can't believe that, these people, most of whom didn't know me, were ready to roll the dice and hire a person with bipolar disorder. And I feel, for the most part, I've been incredibly supported and loved by this network. I don't feel a lot of stigma. I don't feel a lot of people saying to me, well, you're not one of us, so you don't understand us. Whatever us is. It could be a tenured faculty in a special education department, or a dean, or just somebody who's worked in higher ed. Whatever the us is. I don't feel that. I don't feel like people have put up a wall. If anything, I feel the opposite. I feel like people have really welcomed me into the network, recognize that I have skills and experience that are outside of their skill set, and really welcome the opportunity to learn from my skills and then share with me the knowledge that they have so that I can be better as their representative in Washington. So for me, I don't know if you saw my Facebook post. I know you're not on social media a lot, but I did a Facebook post on the night before my fourth anniversary on the job, and I ended it by just talking about how I've fallen in love with the network, and I really have. I'm embarrassed that I worked in the disability field for almost 25 years, and I knew who George Jetson was, and I knew who Bill Kiernan was, and I knew who Andy Bacon was. There were people that I knew, but I didn't really understand what this network was or what it did. And as I've gotten to know the network, I just think it's an incredibly important resource for the entire disability field and for the entire country, and now in this global world that we live in, for the whole world. And my biggest job is just letting people know kind of what a gem this network is, and then letting them know how to access it, including how to come into it as a leader in it, so that we can always have our doors open for people like me that aren't necessarily from the network, but have skills and experience that they can share to help us get better and help us reach more people.
For me personally, Andy, I think as much as you love the network, I think the network loves you, because you have brought a whole bunch of experiences, skills that are not taught within the university setting, and I think that has improved and expanded the network tremendously. So thank you again.
Well, thank you very much for saying that. You were on the board that broke me in, if you will. So thanks for helping me get there, and I'm looking forward to what comes next.
Thank you again.